That's a nice suit. It's a bit outdated, don't you think?
Step back before you get hurt.
The launch was supposed to be the cleanest night of Elise Carver's career. $6 billion of proprietary defense technology, 300 guests in pressed suits and military decorations, every camera in the building running on the very system she had spent 4 years building. Then Vaughn Keats stepped in front of her. He had 4 of his Titan Shield operators with him, broad shoulders, tactical jackets, hands that weren't visible. He looked at the man standing beside Elise and smiled the way people smile when they already know the outcome. "Nice suit," Vaughn said. "A little outdated, don't you think?" Kellen Rhodes didn't answer. He was watching the hands. The moment he saw fingers curl toward concealed grips, he stepped in front of Elise and placed his body between her and the 4 men. One of them laughed. "Step back before you get hurt." The laughter hadn't finished echoing when the steel doors sealed shut weapons came out and Kellen moved forward. He already knew what no camera in the building had caught. If you enjoy stories about people who are underestimated and prove everyone wrong, this channel is built for exactly that. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's get back to Kellen. 3 weeks before the launch, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to Elise Carver's private office on the 32nd floor of Carver Spire. There was no return address. The handwriting on the front belonged to her father. He had been dead for 14 months. Elise sat with the envelope in her hands for a long time before she opened it. Inside was a single index card with a name written in her father's careful block letters, Kellen Rhodes, and below it, one sentence: "When every system tells you that you're safe, trust this man." She didn't know the name. Her assistant couldn't find a current file. The number written on the back of the card rang twice before someone picked up and said nothing. "Kellen Rhodes," Elise said. "Yes," the voice answered. She hired him the next morning, not because she trusted the instruction, but because her father had never once given her advice she could afford to ignore. Kellen arrived without a resume packet, without references on letterhead, and without the kind of firm handshake that men in his profession use to establish dominance in the first 10 seconds. He arrived in a dark suit that had been pressed carefully, but had worn at the cuffs from years of use. He carried a metal pen in his breast pocket and a watch on his wrist that looked older than some of the building's junior staff. He looked around the lobby of Carver Spire with the focus of a person already committing it to memory, not impressed, not anxious, just methodical. He counted the exits before he counted the security cameras. He noted the elevator response time before he noted the floor directory. Elise watched him do all of this from the reception desk and felt, against her better judgment, slightly reassured. Vaughn Keats felt the opposite. Vaughn was the commanding officer of Titan Shield's lead protection detail, 32 personnel, all equipped with smart armor that synced with Sentinel Grid in real time, all trained in protocols that Titan Shield's marketing division liked to call the next generation of executive protection. He was 36 years old, had the build of someone who trained because he enjoyed being the largest person in any room, and had spent the better part of the past week positioning his team at every visible checkpoint in the building. When he saw Kellen Rhodes for the first time, he stared for a moment, then turned to his second-in-command and said something that made both men laugh. He made sure to say it loud enough for Kellen to hear. "Museum piece," Vaughn said. "She hired a museum piece." Kellen didn't react. He asked the receptionist for a building schematic and a copy of the service corridor map, thanked her by name, and walked toward the elevator. In the days that followed, Vaughn made a recurring event of the commentary. At briefings, he referred to Kellen as the legacy system. In the corridors, he stopped to examine Kellen's jacket with theatrical concern, asking whether the budget had run dry. At a joint security review on the 5th morning, he spent 4 minutes explaining to no one in particular, but loudly enough for the room, that genuine executive protection required adaptive technology, integrated threat modeling, and personnel who hadn't been out of circulation for the better part of a decade. Kellen sat through all of it with the expression of a man watching weather pass. What he was actually doing was watching Vaughn's team. He had noticed something in the first 48 hours that he couldn't immediately explain. A small number of Titan Shield operators, 4 of them specifically rotating through the inner corridor assignments, never turned their backs to Vaughn. Not the way subordinates monitor a supervisor, the way soldiers monitor a commanding officer they're waiting on for a signal. They weren't protecting Elise. They were waiting for something to begin. On the third evening, Kellen was crossing the service level at 11:30 when he saw light coming from the secondary sensor hub on the east wall. He stopped in the doorway. Mara Quinn was crouched in front of an open panel, a flashlight between her teeth and a diagnostic tablet in her hands, running a manual calibration on a motion sensor that every automated report showed as functioning normally. She heard him stop and looked up without alarm. "There's a number in the Eastern Corridor response time that doesn't match the installation log," she said, as though she had been expecting to explain this to someone eventually. "Probably nothing. I just can't sleep when a number doesn't match." Kellen looked at the panel, then at her. "What's the variance?" 3 seconds, she said, "on a door that should open in 1. He nodded once and left her to it. She didn't ask why he was walking the service level alone at 11:30 at night. Some people, Kellen had learned, were built to notice things that didn't add up. They didn't need an explanation for why someone else was doing the same. He also noted on his way out that the emergency cooling conduit for Sentinel Grid's primary server stack ran directly alongside the maintenance shaft beside this hub, a detail Mara mentioned almost as an aside, explaining why the sensor reading fluctuated slightly during warm evenings. He filed it away without knowing yet why it mattered. 4 days before the launch, Kellen submitted a formal written report to Elise Carver. It contained 4 findings. The first 4 members of the Titan Shield inner rotation were operating under credentials that could not be verified through any accessible personnel database. The second, a camera cluster on the northeast stairwell, was experiencing a signal interruption of exactly 47 seconds every night at 2 in the morning, too precise to be a technical fault. The third, Sentinel Grid's administrative access log, contained an account that did not belong to any registered Carver Defense employee. The fourth, Elise's movement itinerary for the launch event, had been transmitted to an external server registered under Titan Shield's infrastructure. He presented the report without editorializing and waited. Vaughn reviewed the document for approximately 90 seconds, then set it down on the conference table with the patient expression of someone explaining something elementary. The unverifiable credentials were a standard covert cover protocol, classified not discussable in mixed company. The camera interruption was a known firmware cycle in that generation of Sentinel hardware. The administrative account was an internal redundancy established at the request of Carver Defense's own IT department. The itinerary transmission was a routine logistics share he had personally authorized. He said all of this without raising his voice, and with the polished ease of a man who had rehearsed the answers long before the questions were asked. Derek Sloan, seated at the far end of the table, added that raising alarms this close to the launch could destabilize the confidence of institutional investors who were flying in from overseas specifically for this event. Elise listened to both of them. Then she looked at Kellen. She told him to continue his observation. She told him not to interfere with Titan Shield's operations. He agreed and left the room. That night, he went down to the mechanical level alone. He found the device in 11 minutes mounted on the interior housing of the Eastern Steel Door's remote lock mechanism, marked with a designation code he recognized immediately. Not because he had looked it up, because he had helped design it. It was the internal marking system of a special operations unit dissolved 7 years ago. A unit whose founding members, the people he had trained, whose protocols he had written, had gone on to establish Titan Shield. Earlier that week, during a joint briefing, Vaughn had mentioned, almost in passing, that Titan Shield's operational doctrine was built on methods my father developed. He had said it with pride. Kellen had said nothing, but he had recognized the description because the methods Vaughn was talking about were not things Roland Keats had developed. They were things Roland Keats had taken. He stood in the half-dark of the mechanical level and looked at the device. Then he reached for it.
The lights came on.
Vaughn was at the far end of the corridor with 3 operators behind him, the expression of a man gratified to see a trap work exactly as planned. Within 60 seconds, Elise had been reached by phone. Within 90, Kellen had been ordered to surrender his access card and leave the building. He didn't argue. He handed over the card, removed his communication device, and walked through the lobby and out the front door. He made it 22 feet before he stopped. Through the loading access door to his left, 4 Titan Shield operators from the inner rotation were changing jackets. The weapons underneath bore no registration markings. One of them was securing a compact detonator assembly to his lower back. The device carried the same designation code as the one Kellen had just found in the mechanical level. He understood then what he had not been able to prove until this moment. The threat was not arriving from outside. The protection detail itself was the operation. They didn't need to breach Carver Spire's defenses, they were already wearing them. He reached up and loosened his tie. He moved the metal pen from his breast pocket to inside his left cuff, holding it against the wrist with the pressure of his fingers. Then he walked toward the service tunnel entrance at the base of the building's north face, a route absent from the schematic he had been given, but present in the installation records he had read on his second day in the building. The person who had ordered him out was the same person he had just decided to walk back in to protect. Kellen Rhodes had made peace with that kind of arithmetic a long time ago. Mara Quinn was still in the secondary control room when Kellen found her, same chair, different coffee, same expression of someone who had decided the night wasn't finished. The overhead lights were dimmed to working level. 3 monitors ran simultaneous diagnostic feeds. She had pulled up the administrative access log on the left screen and was staring at it the way she had stared at the mismatched sensor number 4 days ago. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. "Derek told me I misread the file," she said. "I wrote the file. I know what it says." Kellen closed the door behind him. "When did you report it?" "2 weeks ago." She finally turned. She looked at the pen tucked against his sleeve, then at his face, then back at the screen. "He said I was confusing a redundancy account with a shadow profile. I've been building this system for 4 years. I know the difference between a redundancy and an intrusion." She paused. "No one wanted to hear that from me." Kellen crossed to the monitor. The account was nested 3 layers below the standard administrative interface, flagged with maintenance credentials that would have looked routine to anyone who hadn't built the architecture themselves. But the permissions attached to it weren't maintenance permissions. They were override permissions, the kind that didn't ask the system for access. They simply took it. "What can it do?" he asked. Mara pulled up the permission tree and walked him through it without pause, the precise and unhurried delivery of someone explaining something they find genuinely alarming. The account could lock every steel door in the building simultaneously. It could sever all internal and external communications. It could reroute command authority for Sentinel Grid's automated response functions to an external server. Once the reroute completed, the building's entire defense infrastructure, cameras, drones, electronic locks, threat response protocols, would answer to whoever controlled that server. But the reroute required a biological confirmation sequence, fingerprint, voice print, and authorization code, all 3 belonging to Elise Carver. "If we trigger the alarm," Kellen said, "how fast does the account respond?" "Faster than the alarm can complete its cycle," Mara said. "It'll lock every exit before the first responders get the call." She met his eyes steadily. "We have maybe 4 minutes before the main presentation begins, and Vaughn moves his people into final position." Kellen was already moving toward the door. He didn't make it to Elise. The main corridor outside the presentation hall was crowded with guests flowing in from the reception area, and Vaughn was standing at the interior checkpoint with 4 operators spread in a loose arc behind him, the same 4 from the loading dock, back in standard Titan Shield jackets. Their hands were at their sides. Kellen read the hands. He pushed through the last of the crowd and moved toward Elise, who was standing 12 feet away at the entrance to the hall, speaking with a cluster of investors. She saw him, and her expression shifted not to relief, not to alarm, but to something harder. The look of someone who had given an order and was watching it be disobeyed. Vaughn moved first. He stepped into the center of the corridor and spoke loudly enough to carry across the crowd, explaining to the assembled guests that the individual approaching was a suspended security attachment who had already been removed from the premises once this evening for unauthorized access to a restricted area. He delivered it with the smooth authority of someone who understood that public humiliation was its own form of control. He looked at Kellen's suit. He let the pause sit. "Always liked that jacket," Vaughn said. "Little threadbare, though. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence." The people nearest them stopped moving. The corridor went quiet enough that the next voice carried clearly. One of the 4 operators produced a short, dismissive laugh and offered it across the silence as though doing Kellen a courtesy. "Step back before you get hurt." Kellen was not looking at Vaughn. He was tracking the right hand of the operator who had just spoken. The thumb was already hooked toward the jacket lapel, a preparatory motion from a concealed draw drill that Kellen recognized because he had written the drill himself in a training document titled "Minimizing Visible Preparatory Motion During Station Deployment." He stepped forward, moved Elise behind him in a single motion, and struck before the first weapon cleared its holster. He broke the wrist on the draw, used that body as cover while he stripped the weapon, drove his elbow into the second operator's throat, and was rotating toward the third when the 4th man's hand came up with the activation trigger. It was not a detonator for explosives. It was a frequency transmitter, a single pulse sent directly to Sentinel Grid's administrative override account. Every steel door in Carver Spire sealed simultaneously. The sound moved through the building like a low structural exhale. Emergency lighting kicked on in amber strips along the floor. The communications array went dark. 3 operators were down. Kellen held the recovered weapon and stood between Elise and the sealed corridor while the crowd's noise reorganized itself into the particular silence of people realizing the doors are not going to open on their own. Vaughn looked at him for a moment. Then very slightly he smiled and gave the order that had apparently been waiting all evening. Titan Shield moved with the precision of a unit that had rehearsed this exact scenario. The separation was clean guests directed into the main hall, Carver defense staff isolated from their own systems, the handful of loyal protective agents neutralized by a remote lockout signal sent through Sentinel Grid's compromised administrative channel directly to their own smart armor. Derek Sloan walked onto the stage in the main hall as though he had always planned to be the one standing at the podium. He didn't explain himself at length. The sealed doors had done most of the explaining. He simply announced that the evening's agenda would be adjusted and asked everyone to remain where they were. In the service corridor behind the main hall, Kellen moved Elise through a maintenance junction absent from Titan Shield's building schematic, a routing path for electrical maintenance crews omitted from the Carver Defense Security overlay because someone had decided it was too narrow to be a meaningful access point. It was 41 inches wide. Kellen had measured it on his 3rd day in the building. When they stopped at the secondary junction, Elise turned to face him. "You know this building better than my own security team," she said. "Your security team was given the schematic they were supposed to have," Kellen said. "I went looking for the one they weren't." "Who are you?" He told her what she needed to know. 12 years ago, Kellen had been the lead training officer for a classified protective operations unit that no longer officially existed. His job had been to construct the protocols, the movement patterns, the contingency grids, the close quarters engagement doctrine that a small group of personnel would carry into high-risk assignments around the world. He had trained those people himself. He had trusted them. One of them had been Roland Keats. When Roland left government service and founded Titan Shield, he took everything Kellen had built with him. Every protocol in Titan Shield's operational playbook had originated in documents Kellen authored. Every technique Vaughn's operators were using tonight had been field-tested in exercises Kellen designed. Vaughn hadn't developed his own system. He had grown up in a house built on his father's theft and inherited both the methods and the blind spots that came with them. "And my father," Elise said quietly. "Where does he come in?" Kellen told her. 7 years ago, he had been the lead protective officer on a convoy assignment, a diplomatic transport, through a deteriorating threat environment. The route had been verified, the checkpoints confirmed. 48 hours before departure, the route was changed without his knowledge through a channel that required senior authorization. The convoy was struck in the third segment. 3 of his people died. 11 hours after the attack, Kellen traced the route change back to Roland Keats. Roland had sold the convoy's position to an arms procurement network that needed the transport neutralized to move their own shipment through the same corridor. When Kellen moved to report it, he found he couldn't. Roland was holding a group of civilians, 8 people with no connection to the operation, in a secondary location. The message didn't need to be delivered in words. Kellen withdrew the report. He accepted the formal finding that his own failure had caused the convoy's exposure. He was removed from the unit and stayed removed. The 8 civilians were extracted that same night by a single individual who had been tracking Roland's movements independently for reasons Kellen was never fully told. That individual was Elise's father. Elise stood in the amber half-light of the maintenance corridor without speaking for several seconds. "He never told me," she said. "He wasn't supposed to," Kellen said. "Neither was I." Before either of them could continue, Mara's voice came through the one surviving internal communications channel, a maintenance frequency running on a circuit separate from Sentinel Grid's primary network, which was how it had outlasted the lockdown. "I found the activation pathway for the reroute. I can block it, but only from the primary server stack, top floor." Kellen looked up at the junction ceiling. The top floor. Back through everything they had just come from. "Can you delay the confirmation sequence from where you are?" he asked. "I can slow it. I cannot stop it." Elise had already understood the geometry. If the reroute completed, Sentinel Grid's entire infrastructure became a weapon. Every facility in its network, every military installation, transit hub, and financial clearinghouse running Carver defense integration, all of it answering to a server controlled by people who had just sealed 300 civilians inside a tower. "We have to go back up," she said. They moved through the service shaft to the upper mechanical level, Mara guiding them through the maintenance frequency in short, precise directions. She knew which shaft ran adjacent to which conduit, which stairwell camera had a blocked sightline from the northeast corner, which floor's sensor grid reset on a 17-second cycle. She had spent 4 years learning this building by paying attention to things other people had decided didn't matter. They were 30 feet from the server room entrance when Vaughn's voice came through the overhead address system. "I was going to let you leave," he said. The audio was calm and unhurried, the voice of a man confident the evening was proceeding as planned. "The door was open. You could have walked out, made your calls, and by the time anyone arrived, this would have been finished. But here you are." The corridor lights went out. Amber emergency strips replaced them a second later. Vaughn was in the corridor. He was wearing the exoskeletal enhancement rig that Titan Shield had developed for close protection operations, a full-body frame integrated with Sentinel Grid's primary camera network, feeding real-time positional data to the suit's movement prediction system. The rig didn't make him faster than Kellen in any absolute sense. It made him faster by exactly the margin that decided outcomes. It showed him where Kellen was going before Kellen arrived. Kellen moved. The rig moved with him, not in reaction, but in anticipation. The first exchange lasted 11 seconds. He took a strike to the left shoulder that separated something he didn't have time to identify. The second exchange was shorter. He lost the recovered weapon in the third. Vaughn drove him into the corridor wall, lifted him by the collar, and brought him down hard against the floor. He did it twice more. The third time, he let Kellen stay down, then dragged him to the server room entrance and positioned him in front of Elise. "Look at what your father trusted. Look at what that trust produced." Then he carried Kellen to the maintenance shaft at the end of the corridor and threw him in. Kellen caught the cable, one hand first, then both. He hung in the dark above a drop he chose not to measure because measuring it wasn't useful. Above him, through the shaft housing, he heard the server room door open. He heard the confirmation terminal power up, fingerprint first, then voice, then the 6-digit code. The detonator Mara had told him was synced to the same sequence, 6 minutes from the moment confirmation began. Kellen hung in the dark and looked sideways. The cable he was holding ran parallel to a conduit. The conduit fed the emergency cooling array for Sentinel Grid's primary server stack. He knew this because Mara had mentioned it on the night he found her alone in the service corridor with a flashlight and a side shared between two people who both had the habit of explaining the details everyone else ignored. He began to move. The emergency cooling array had a manual override panel built into the conduit, housing a physical failsafe that existed precisely because the people who designed the system understood that digital controls eventually failed. Kellen found it by moving hand over hand along the cable for 40 feet. In the dark, his left arm responding at approximately 60% capacity, his breathing measured against the pain in his side. He located the panel by feel. The lock was a standard mechanical tumbler. The metal pen opened it in under 20 seconds. He pulled the lever. Deep in the building's infrastructure, the emergency cooling system engaged at full capacity. Temperature in the primary server room dropped sharply. Sentinel Grid's power management system responded as designed, automatically rerouting to backup circuits to protect data integrity during the thermal event. The exoskeletal rig on Vaughn Keats's body drew its positional feed exclusively from Sentinel Grid's primary network architecture. The rig's firmware had been built to interface with a specific encryption standard and handshake sequence the primary networks. The backup circuit ran an entirely different protocol. When the primary network handed off to backup power, the rig received no recognizable signal at all. The display went dark. The predictive movement system went with it. In the server room, Mara registered the change in terminal response time before she understood its cause. The confirmation sequence had stalled, not failed, but paused, waiting for the network to stabilize after the power reroute. She felt the temperature drop from the server vents above her and understood immediately. She looked at the two operators standing between her and the terminal. Both were watching Elise. Neither was watching her. She had been sitting with her wrists zip-tied to a support column for 20 minutes. The broken equipment rack 3 feet to her left had a sheared metal edge at approximately wrist height. She had been thinking about that edge since the moment they secured her. She worked the plastic against the metal. 4 passes. On the 5th, it split. She crossed to the terminal without hurrying, the measured pace of someone who understood exactly what she was doing, and reversed 2 lines in the confirmation sequence's authentication code. The change would register as a system error and reset the countdown timer without triggering the lockout protocol. The detonator's 6-minute window reset. One of the operators turned. Mara looked at him across the terminal. "I wrote this system," she said. "You're not getting into it tonight." The access panel at the far end of the server room opened, the one connected to the cooling conduit maintenance path, filed under a separate post-construction permit, and absent from every schematic Titan shield had been given. Kellen came through it. His left arm was held close to his body. There was blood at his collar and a fresh tear along the shoulder seam of his jacket. The cuffs were still worn at the edges, the same as every day that week. 6 Titan shield operators turned toward him. Vaughn stood behind them, the exoskeletal rig discarded on the floor where he had pulled it off when it stopped responding. He had Elise by the arm. His sidearm was in his other hand. The operators looked at Kellen, at the damaged shoulder, the careful way he held himself, the obvious deficit in what he had available, and arrived at the same calculation Vaughn had been making all week. They had seen what the rig had done to him in the corridor. They were looking at a man who had already been beaten once tonight. They moved. Kellen reached up and activated the server room's fire suppression system. The ceiling discharged a burst of clean agent suppressant, a colorless gas engineered to reduce oxygen concentration below the threshold that sustained combustion without incapacitating the people in the room. It was the system installed in every serious server environment specifically because water or chemical foam would destroy the equipment it was meant to protect. The discharge was loud. The pressure shift hit every person in the room simultaneously in the ears. For 3 full seconds, every assumption in the room reset. 3 seconds was what Kellen needed. He had done the count when he came through the panel, 6 operators' positions, noted distances estimated. He moved to the first man's last known location and made contact before the man finished reorienting. He used that operator's restraint cords to take the second off his feet. The third walked into the frame of the discarded exoskeletal rig, which Kellen had determined would be in that position based on the direction Vaughn had been facing when he shed it. The fourth and fifth lost each other in the noise and confusion and ended up on the same side of the room where they became each other's problem. The sixth operator went still. He stood with his back against the wall and counted what he could see of his teammates where they had ended up what they were doing and arrived at a number he didn't like. Kellen looked at him and said nothing. The operator set his weapon on the floor and stepped back. Vaughn released Elise's arm. He let his sidearm fall and came across the room with the energy of a man who had been building toward this specific moment for longer than just tonight. All the commentary about the outdated suit, the legacy system, the museum piece, it had never truly been contempt. It had been distance, a way of not looking directly at something he understood at some level he couldn't afford to examine too closely. His father had told him once, when Vaughn was 19 and newly enrolled in his first tactical program, that there had been one instructor he had never been able to outmaneuver in a live exercise. He had described the man in 3 words and then changed the subject. Vaughn had never pressed for a name. The way his father moved away from the topic had been information enough. Looking at Kellen across the server room floor, Vaughn finally understood who his father had been talking about. He fought the way he had always fought, with aggression and physical confidence, and the expectation that superior force applied early enough would settle the outcome before skill became the deciding factor. Without the rig, he was still very good. Kellen was something else. Kellen didn't match Vaughn's force. He moved out of its path and let it go where it was going. He allowed Vaughn to commit to angles that left him off balance, then gave him nothing to land on. He absorbed 2 strikes he couldn't fully avoid, registered them, and offered no visible reaction because a visible reaction would have given Vaughn something useful. Vaughn's attacks came faster. Faster meant less precise. Kellen had been waiting for that. When Vaughn pulled the blade from his jacket and moved it toward Elise, not to harm her, but to reintroduce leverage to put something back in the room he could control, Kellen put his left forearm across the path of the draw. The blade caught the outside of his arm. He closed his hand around Vaughn's wrist before the arc could complete, rotated hard against the joint, and brought Vaughn down across the edge of the main control console with enough force to end the engagement. Vaughn stayed down. Kellen straightened slowly. He looked at the blade on the floor, then at his arm, then at Elise. The opportunity to finish it was plain. He stepped back from it. A man who couldn't speak couldn't testify, and there were 3 families who had been waiting 7 years for someone to stand in a room and tell the truth about a road that had been sold out from under the people driving it. Derek Sloan spent the final 4 minutes of the crisis moving through the executive stairwell toward the rooftop helipad, the one route he had been confident remained available. His contingency planning had been thorough. It had not accounted for Elise Carver's insistence 18 months earlier and over Derek's explicit objection on retaining a physical override for every rooftop access point that operated on a circuit independent of the main security grid. 30 seconds before Derek reached the door, Mara had restored Elise's administrative credentials through the secondary terminal, a narrow window, but enough. The rooftop door sealed when Elise issued the command. Derek sat down on a stairwell step. In the server room, Mara transferred the complete contents of Titan Shield's operational planning files, staged in the shadow account for 4 months, positioned to erase themselves after a successful Sentinel grid transfer, to every display screen in the main presentation hall. 300 investors, defense officials, and journalists who had been held in that room for the past hour looked up and began to read. Kellen crossed to the detonator assembly mounted beside the power core. He examined the component sequence for 15 seconds, identifying the order in which each connection needed to be separated. When the final connection came free, 2 seconds remained on the timer. He set the components down carefully on the floor. Then he went to find something to wrap around his arm. 6 months later, the training facility on the 4th floor of Carver Spire had no photographs on the walls. It had one document, a printed list of names formatted without decoration, pinned to the corkboard beside the main door. The names belonged to every person who had been inside the building on the night of the Sentinel grid launch. All of them had gone home. Kellen walked in wearing the same suit. The tear at the shoulder had been repaired by someone with skill who hadn't tried to conceal the seam. The cuffs were still worn at the edges. A trainee, 24 years old, 3 weeks into the program, looked at the jacket with the particular expression of someone encountering something whose value isn't immediately legible. "Why don't you get a new one?" she asked. Kellen considered it honestly. "It reminds me," he said, "that what you look like doesn't decide who's still standing at the end." She wrote it down. He didn't tell her to. Elise stood at the far end of the room reviewing the week's assessment reports. She had made 3 public statements since the launch to her employees, to her institutional partners, and to the Defense Procurement Board that had been on the verge of canceling Carver Defense's primary government contract. In all 3, the substance had been the same. She had mistaken the appearance of security for the thing itself, and she had been corrected by the person she had been quickest to dismiss. Mara had been appointed to lead the internal review of Sentinel Grid's architecture. She had opened the review by submitting a 14-page document cataloging 18 months of internal warnings that had been ignored, names, dates, and exact language included. Derek Sloan's name appeared 11 times. She was currently in an office with a door that locked from the inside, drinking coffee that was still hot. Kellen stood before the new training group and didn't tell them what he had done on the night the steel doors sealed. He told them what he had noticed in the days before it. The hands that moved wrong, the door that opened 3 seconds too slowly, the engineer alone in a service corridor at midnight because a single number hadn't added up. He told them that protection was not a performance. It was attention sustained and directed where it actually mattered. He told them that the line "step back before you get hurt" was not necessarily wrong. It had simply been pointed at the wrong person. Stories like Kellen's stay with us because they reflect something true: the distance between how people appear and what they actually are. The most costly assumption we make isn't usually about strangers. It's about the quiet person in the room we've already decided doesn't matter. Kellen didn't prove anyone wrong by being louder or by wearing a better suit. He proved them wrong by doing the work before anyone was watching, before it paid off, and before there was any guarantee it would. If that kind of story means something to you, there are more where this came from. Subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who tends to underestimate the quiet people around them, and we'll see you in the next one.